Thank you very much, Professor Yarbrough, for your introduction. I would also like to thank the Office of the President and the Rohatyn Center for Global Affairs, without which this event could not happen. And finally, thank you all so much for attending tonight's lecture. My name is Sarah Cohen, and I serve as Middlebury Hillel's Israel Action Chair this semester. Middlebury is honored to host Ambassador Dennis Ross this evening, and I would like to take a few moments to highlight some of his many accomplishments. Ambassador Dennis Ross played a leading role in shaping United States involvement in the Middle East peace process under both Democratic and Republican administrations. He was the U.S. point person on the peace process under Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and served 2 years as Special Assistant to President Barack Obama. Ambassador Ross also served 2 years as Senior Director of the National Security Council for the Central Region, and 1 year as Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on Iran. Ambassador Ross was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians reach landmark agreements, including the 1995 Interim Agreement and the 1997 Hebron Accord. He also facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. Ambassador Ross is author of several influential books on the Middle East peace process, including Myths, Illusions, and Peace, Finding a New Direction for America in the Middle East, and The Missing Piece, The Inside Story of the Fight for Middle East Peace. He now serves as counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Ambassador Ross is one of the world's leading experts on Middle East politics. He's also that rare figure who is respected by Democrats, Republicans, Israelis, and Palestinians alike. He exemplifies diplomatic excellence through his unique ability to cross political and social lines, facilitate conversation between parties, and reach solutions. Middlebury values these same ideals, and we are fortunate to be part of a campus community that fosters open and constructive dialogue on contentious and often emotional issues. I hope tonight's discussion will reverberate throughout campus discourse on the Middle East long after Ambassador Ross's lecture. On this note, I would like to mention that a group of Middlebury students is working to create a new organization, the Middlebury Forum for Israel, to facilitate campus dialogue on the Middle East. The forum hopes to continue a lively and nuanced discussion on the issues surrounding Israel, the peace process, and the implications of the Arab awakening in the future. Finally, before I invite Ambassador Ross to speak, I would like to invite you to a reception immediately following this lecture, where you will have the opportunity to meet Ambassador Ross. The reception will be held in McCullough Social Space. Middlebury is very grateful and honored to have Ambassador Ross here with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. You know, when you want to talk about the Middle East today, you almost don't know where to start, and you almost for certain don't know where to stop. You know, during the Passover Seder, one of the things that Jews do is they say, you know, if God had only allowed us to get out of Egypt, that would have been enough. The term that's used is it would have been dayenu. Well, think about it today in the Middle East. If it was only Iran and the nuclear threat, it would be enough. If it was only Syria, where we're seeing a blight on the international conscience, it would be enough. In fact, it would be more than enough. If it was only Egypt and the Arab awakening, that would be enough. If it was only the Israelis and the Palestinians, that would be enough. And yet today we have to deal with all of it. So, as I said, when you deal with the Middle East, you almost don't know where to start. Now, I could start with the issue of peace, but I can tell you in the region itself, that's not what most people are focused on. What I'd like to do tonight is sort of talk about a number of these issues, and I'll conclude with the peace issue because, A, I was asked to, B, I don't go anywhere without talking about it, so I'll do it. But I think it needs to be put in the context of what's happening in the region as a whole. And the place I think to start is with the very idea of what's happening in this region, which today is characterized by upheaval, transformation, and uncertainty. Now, I'm going to start with a question for you. How many people here think that the term Arab Spring is an appropriate term? You can raise your hand. How many people think it's an appropriate term? Okay? How many people think Arab Spring is not an appropriate term? Now you might ask yourself, why am I asking this question? We've all heard the term Arab Spring used over and over and over again. But what does Arab Spring imply? Arab Spring implies that there was a transformation that was going to take place and was in fact taking place in the Middle East, and it was going to be very fast. It was going to be rapid. We were going to see a transformation that was not only promising, but like spring itself, would blossom and flower very soon. The equivalent would be democracy would come to the Middle East and would come very quickly. Certainly those were the hopes in Tahrir Square, but that's not the reality that we've seen. And the truth is, it couldn't have been. There is an awakening in the Middle East outside of the monarchies. Think about it. In every Arab country that is not a monarchy, we've seen upheaval. Every single one. There is an awakening. You might ask the question, so why is it that we haven't seen it in the monarchies? Well, the reason is the monarchies at least have a semblance of legitimacy. Whether we relate to it or not, they have a justification for why they're in power. What was Mubarak's justification for being in power? To hold power, pure and simple, nothing more, and really not much less. So in the non-monarchies, where there really wasn't a justification, where there really wasn't legitimacy, what we've seen is upheaval. Now, it's an awakening because what's happened in much of the Middle East, you see people seeing themselves as citizens for the first time. They see themselves as being citizens and not as subjects. Now think about what the difference is between being a citizen and being a subject. When you're a citizen, you can make demands. When you're a subject, it's the regime that imposes demands on you. When you're a citizen, you have a voice. When you're a subject, it's the regime that has the voice and you have to listen. When you're a citizen, you can have hopes and dreams and a sense of possibility. When you're a subject, it is the regime that defines the possibilities. And when you're a citizen, you can create accountability. That's your right as a citizen. When you're a subject, it is the regime that imposes accountability on you. Now, the reason we've seen an awakening is because people see themselves as citizens and not subjects. The reason the awakening can't be translated into a new reality very quickly is because the institutions for accountability don't exist. They have to be created. It should come as no surprise that the Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood, have been the ones who are most successful in the early going of this transformation. They're the only ones who are allowed to organize. Again, take a step back, think about it. In these non-monarchies, and by the way, just because I'm saying the monarchies have been affected, it doesn't mean they're going to be immune. The fact is, this awakening has a kind of infectious quality. But in the places where the awakening is accompanied by terrible violence, terrible destruction, terrible chaos, it also reduces the impulse of some of those in the monarchies that want to see too rapid change come too soon. But it should not be a surprise that in the non-monarchies, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamists, are the ones who emerge first. Understand, in regimes where the leadership really wasn't legitimate, what was the one institution that existed that they could not take on? By the way, when I pose these questions, what you can count on is I can answer the questions. What's the one institution they couldn't take on? They couldn't take on the mosque. That was authentic, that was legitimate, and the mosque was the one place where you were free to say what you wanted to say. The mosque was the one place where you could stand up. The mosque was the one place where you could organize. The Muslim Brotherhood used the mosque as the basis to create not only their identity, to foster their organization, to create a basis to be identified with social justice. They created a network of clinics throughout the country. They would respond when the regime would not. They didn't have to produce social justice and a welfare system for everybody. They could do it in small doses and in small pieces, and they did. You know, when there was an earthquake in Cairo, who was out distributing blankets and food and water? Well, it wasn't the government. It was the Muslim Brotherhood. Who was organized throughout the countryside? 40% of Egypt lives on $2 a day or less. Who organized them? Muslim Brotherhood. What was the focal point in their life? The mosque. it should come as no surprise that when you had elections, it was the Muslim Brotherhood that was organized, that was effective, that was credible, that had a message, that had an identity. The secular opposition was stigmatized by all sorts of things. First, the regime was secular. That carried a price. They didn't relate and couldn't organize themselves because they weren't permitted to organize themselves. There was no way they created connections with rural society or with the 40% who live on $2 a day or less. So when you had elections, what a surprise that the one group that could do well was the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis. Now, does that mean that the story is over? That because they won the initial elections, that's the end of it? That the transformation has already unfolded? The answer, if you're paying any attention, is obviously no. And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. There is an awakening. People who didn't have a voice for 40 years and suddenly have it, they're not going to give it up. President Morsi thought that, he could, after he brokered a ceasefire between the Israelis and Hamas, that he could immediately go ahead, take advantage of something he had done and for which he was being celebrated in the region and internationally, and he could parlay that into a new decree that would remove judicial restraint on him. And what did it produce? It produced a big backlash. Because the fact is, the public in Egypt has a set of expectations, but they also have a voice. The Muslim Brotherhood, if they want to flourish, they're going to have to deliver. And it's not going to be so easy to deliver because the Egyptian economy is in desperate straits. Look at where we are today in Egypt. Today what we see in Egypt is instability, chaos. We have the security forces on strike. We have the secular opposition saying they're not going to participate in the upcoming parliamentary elections because they think the deck is stacked against them. The Muslim Brotherhood has acted in a way that I would say at a certain level has surprised me. I'm not surprised that they seek control. I'm not surprised that they have a very strong philosophy. I'm not surprised they are an organization that is highly structured, hierarchical, disciplined. Over the years, anybody who hasn't basically hewed to their basic line has been drummed out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Nothing surprises me about the character of the organization in terms of its identity, its ideas, its discipline, its hierarchy. What has surprised me is I thought they would be more tactically adept. There's no way in the early going they're going to deliver on improving life within Egypt because of the state of the economy. I thought they would be more inclusive to begin with. They haven't been. I thought they would put less of a premium on control. They have not. They put a complete premium on control. After President Morsi adopted this decree that was going to basically do away with judicial oversight, when there was the backlash, he agreed to modify parts of it. But what he wouldn't agree to do was to put off a referendum on a constitution that had been rammed through the parliament. Here was a referendum that was scheduled to take place in 2 weeks. The opposition said, put it off because, in a sense, we haven't been involved in the dialogue and the discussions with it. And he insisted there would be no change in that. Why? Because a referendum was one they knew they would win because of their organizational advantages. And he knew that with the passage of the Constitution, it would create a new basis of political legitimacy for the Muslim Brotherhood in the country. But what he also didn't seem to fully recognize is it would cement the nature of opposition to Muslim Brotherhood rule. So today we have the Muslim Brotherhood in control, but the question is increasingly in control of what? They can't easily deliver on the economy. They can't easily produce stability. They're going to have to find a way to deal with the opposition if they want Egypt to begin to move forward. What's interesting to me is that they do seem to recognize, and President Morsi does seem to recognize, that it's very important for him to improve the economy. One of the most interesting things, again, is he brokered this agreement between Hamas and Israel to bring the fighting in Gaza to a halt. He's been very careful not to break the peace treaty with Israel because he realizes if he does it, he's not going to get help from the outside. When Secretary of State Kerry was in Egypt about 10 days ago, he made a commitment to him to finalize what was necessary to get the loan from the IMF, which they desperately need, even though the conditions on that will mean reducing the subsidies on food and fuel. He is responsive to things that we ask of him at a certain level because he needs and wants help from the outside. There's an interesting paradox. On the one hand, there's a recognition that Egypt needs help from the outside because of the economy. On the other hand, there isn't an openness to really working with the opposition on the inside. So what's going to happen in Egypt? I think this is a story that's being written. We shouldn't exaggerate the influence we're going to have over it. We're not the ones who produced the revolution in Egypt. We're not the ones who are going to produce how it's going to evolve. We happen to have a stake in what happens there. And so what we do should be focused on where can we have some influence and what should guide us. And here I'll suggest to you that we should be guided by some principles. Now the principles I'm going to outline also, by the way, fit with the practicalities that Egypt is facing. Egypt needs dramatic help from the outside. They need substantial assistance, but even more, they need massive investment. Egypt had hard currency reserves at the beginning of the revolution 2 years ago of $36 billion. Today, the hard currency reserves they have, they say are $13 billion. I think they're substantially less. And they need those hard currency reserves to basically have anything to function as an economy. So what should we be doing? We should be guided by the following principles. Number one, our principle should be, we will continue to work with you. We recognize you. The last thing we want is a failed state in Egypt. By the way, that should be an objective of ours. We do not want a failed state in Egypt. A failed state in Egypt, a country of close to 90 million people, that will radiate throughout the region. So we don't want it. But ultimately, it's not in our control. The question is going to be, what does the Muslim Brotherhood do? What does President Morsi do? And our approach ought to be, we'll work with you. We're prepared to help you. We're even prepared to help mobilize support and assistance and even investment for you, provided you play by a certain set of rules. Rule number one, respect minority rights. Now, I said these are principles for us, but they're also practicalities for the Egyptians. If the Coptic Christians, who represent 10% of the Egyptian population, start leaving in droves because they fear for their security, who is going to invest in Egypt? The answer is pretty obvious, nobody. So principle number one, practicality number one, respect minority rights. Principle number two, don't exclude half your population. 56% of Egyptian women are illiterate. This is going to be a successful society if they're excluded. One of the objections of the secular opposition to the way the Constitution is written is that they think there's not going to be rights. There will not be women's rights. A principle for us, but a practicality for the Egyptian, don't exclude half your population. A third principle, respect political pluralism. Maintain the space for political competition. Here again, if you don't do it, you're going to have instability. It's a principle for us, but it's a practicality for them. Again, if there's going to be nothing but instability and chaos, who's going to rush to be investing in Egypt? And a fourth principle, respect your international obligations, including your peace treaty with Israel. Same point, same practicality. A principle for us, a practicality for them. If they break that peace treaty, if there's conflict with Israel, who again is going to say, gee, Egypt is a great place to invest? Now these kinds of principles, these guidelines, I think can be something that helps us in terms of how we deal with Egypt, but it also can be helpful to Egypt if they, in a sense, are prepared to live up to these kinds of principles. These principles, I would say, as a rule, should guide us not just with regard to Egypt. They should guide us with regard to Tunisia, where you have a similar kind of transformation taking place. In a place like Syria, we are dealing with something profoundly different. In Syria, we are looking at a conflict that began as a peaceful demonstration against the Assad regime. Those who were initially demonstrating, all they were demonstrating for was reform. This wasn't about replacing the regime. This wasn't about a revolution. It was about reform. But those who were demonstrating peacefully were met with brutal violence. And what was a peaceful demonstration has turned into a terrible civil war. The numbers are almost impossible to contemplate. We're talking about at least 70,000 dead. We know there are 1 million refugees who are registered, which means that doesn't capture all the refugees who have left Syria. Those who aren't registered, they exceed, and I can't tell you by what number, nobody knows by what number, but we know there's more than 1 million refugees. The 1 million refugees on the outside are probably a third of those who are displaced on the inside. And those who are displaced on the inside, don't have access to food, medical care. The schools have become places where people have moved, so that the educational system has completely broken down. Think about what I just said. I said maybe 2 to 3 million who are internally displaced on the inside, more than 1 million who are refugees on the outside, more than 70,000 dead, and the total population of Syria, 21 million. Can you think about what that means? If we're talking about 4 to 5 million people who are affected by this, it's a quarter of the population. I mean, think about if we had something like that in this country, a quarter of 300 million. What are you talking about? This is a catastrophe. Now, if it was only a human catastrophe, we would all lament it and feel what a terrible reality, what a terrible disgrace it is. But you have to bear in mind something. The Las Vegas rules don't apply in Syria. What takes place in Syria isn't going to stay in Syria. Syria will destabilize the entire area around it. And who borders Syria? Jordan today has 400,000 refugees. Iraq, where we now have Al-Qaeda in Iraq moving into Syria, radical Shia groups moving into Syria. We just had we had 40 Syrian soldiers killed in Iraq by Al-Qaeda in Iraq because they had moved across the border. The potential to destabilize all the surrounding areas is very high. So you have Jordan, you have Turkey, you have Iraq, you have Lebanon, you have Israel. What happens today in Syria is going to radiate outwards, and we're going to have to deal with it. Now, we already see signs that our approach, the American approach, is evolving. And one of the reasons it's evolving is while there's a deep concern about not getting sucked into a quagmire in Syria, which is understandable, and while there's been a deep concern about not wanting to arm the opposition, not knowing for sure where the arms are going to end up, again, it's understandable. But there comes a point where the costs of inaction greatly outweigh the costs of action. And it's not just, as I said, the human catastrophe, it's also that you're going to see the situation get worse and worse unless we try to become more active and try to influence the balance of forces among the opposition. Here I would say I'd recommend 3 courses of action at this point. Number 1, we have to think about what we can do to influence the balance of forces among the opposition. Today, the balance is tending to favor the radical Islamists, Al-Qaeda types, jihadis. They're the ones who have money and means. They're the ones who have money and arms. And so if you don't want them to define the future of Syria, which in all likelihood is going to be a country that breaks apart and becomes a failed state, and therefore radiates both great problems on the inside and towards the outside, then you need to begin to affect the balance of forces in the opposition. That means being prepared to provide not only non-lethal assistance and money, humanitarian assistance, but it also means providing arms. Is there a risk? Yes. But can you manage the risk? Potentially. Secretary Kerry said last week that the arms that are going to more inclusive, moderate forces are being accountable. There really isn't a slippage. But there are things we can do to make it more likely that there isn't. We can identify those we're prepared to work with. We can make certain they make certain commitments to us about the future of Syria, about its inclusiveness, about its being non-sectarian, about accounting for the arms that are provided to them. If we provide them certain arms and we see that they fulfill the commitments, then you can provide them more. It is something that we should pursue on a kind of testing basis. But not to do anything will ensure that the situation only gets worse. So the first thing you can do is try to affect the balance of forces in the opposition so that we have some influence in the situation. The second thing I think we have to do is we're going to have to do more to protect the Syrian public. I described what's going on. Now, the United States, the administration has provided $385 million of humanitarian assistance. The problem has been we provide it through the UN. And the UN feels it has to work only with the regime. Now, the regime doesn't allow the assistance to go to any area that they don't control. Now, do you think all the displaced people are only in the places the regime controls? Do you think even a majority of the displaced people are in the region that the regime controls? These are rhetorical questions. Recently, the UN began to work with groups like Doctors Without Borders, not working through the regime, and the administration for some time has been trying to shift more of our assistance again to these groups that the regime doesn't control. We need to put our entire focus on the groups that the regime does not control, because today it's not only what the displaced people within Syria are experiencing, and they're not getting the kind of assistance that they need, not by a long shot. It's that much of the Syrian public today blames us for not having done enough to protect them and to provide assistance to them. Now here, there's something else we can do. It isn't just humanitarian assistance that we can provide. We can also focus on what can be done to provide greater protection. Now, for some time, I was actually an advocate for a no-fly zone. There has been arguments on the part of many that a no-fly zone involves mission creep, and it's very expensive, and it's very costly, and you don't know where it ends up. So I have an alternative suggestion. I have a no-fly zone on the cheap. We put batteries of Patriot missiles along the border between Turkey and Syria. It's right on the border, next to Syria. They have a range, the Patriot missiles. They have a range of over 50 miles. We can create a no-fly protected area of 50 miles below into northern Syria. That, by the way, would encompass the city of Aleppo, which is continuing to be subjected to aerial bombardment. We could say that any airplane that is flying within 50 miles would be deemed to have a hostile intent. And you wouldn't have to have NATO aircraft flying. You simply use the Patriots. And that would be a no-fly zone on the cheap. At least it would create a safe area in Syria that doesn't exist today. So that's the second thing I would do. So the first thing is begin to provide lethal assistance in a calibrated, testing fashion to the opposition. Second thing is provide humanitarian assistance not through the regime. Create a no-fly zone at least by using the Patriot missiles. And then the third thing, we have to begin to think about a hedging strategy. We're going to need to think about what can we do to contain what's going on in Syria. You don't want to make the breakdown of the state more likely, but we're already well advanced in that regard. And it could be that what I'm suggesting, it's already too late. We need to begin to think about how do you build buffers so that what is taking place in Syria doesn't spread out. So here I am. I've started by talking about Egypt. I've talked about Syria. And as I said, each of these topics by itself, if this was the only challenge the administration was facing today, it would be enough. It would be Diana. But it's not. There is Iran. And I would say that I believe this year may end up being a decisive year one way or the other on Iran. Now I say that because the President has made it very clear that our objective is prevention, not containment, of a nuclear Iran. What does that mean? Containment would mean Iran crosses the threshold and becomes a nuclear weapon state, and we live with it and we contain it after the fact. Prevention means we think that Iran acquiring that capability is so dangerous, so likely to produce a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, meaning the Middle East becomes a nuclear armed region, that you are likely to end up with a nuclear war being fought at some point in the Middle East, that the President adopted a position and an objective of prevention, meaning we will prevent them from doing that. Now, there is a way out through diplomatic means. We are engaged. We've just had, after an 8-month hiatus, we've had negotiations between the permanent 5 members of the Security Council and Germany and the Iranians. They are pursuing what is known as a step-by-step approach. Now, it's possible it could work. I have to tell you, I have low expectations that a step-by-step approach could work. I hope it can, but I'm more dubious that it can, because I think there's always a built-in asymmetry between the two sides. Whenever you do a kind of step-by-step, the step we ask of the Iranians they regard as being of great value to them, and what they're getting in return they regard as being of little value to them. We're reluctant to offer more because the step they will initially take, which is limiting their enrichment of 20% to 20%, we view that as being something that's valuable, but it doesn't change the character of their program, so why would we take off the main sources of the pressure? So you have a basic asymmetry between the two sides. I would much prefer us to put an endgame proposal on the table. One that basically says to the Iranians, you say you want civil nuclear power, And we're prepared to live with you having civil nuclear power. Let's define what it means, but you need to understand when we define it, it means that you can't have the kind of civil nuclear power that would allow you to create a rapid breakout capability to nuclear weapons. So if you're prepared, you say you only want civil nuclear power to generate electricity. If that's what you're prepared for, then we're prepared to allow you to have that, but we're going to put restrictions on it, and we're going to have transparency measures to know you're not cheating on those restrictions to ensure you can't turn it into nuclear weapons. The Iranians claim that's all they want. I would say let's put them to the test. And the sooner you put them to the test, the sooner you know whether there's a diplomatic way out or not. They're under sufficient pressure right now that they may have an interest in it. You know, to put this in perspective, the Iranians in 2009 were exporting, they were able to produce overall 4.2 million barrels a day of oil. All right? They were exporting at that time 2.6 million barrels a day. Today, their overall output is 2.2 million barrels a day. About half of what their overall output was in 2009. And their export is about 1 million barrels a day, substantially less than half of what they were exporting then. 85% of the government's revenues come from their export of oil. So they're hurting. Their currency has been dramatically devalued. They can't do normal business or commerce with anybody else in the world. And if this trend continues, they're going to find that it has a potential impact on their own stability. So the potential for them to want to find a diplomatic way out exists. The reality that from our standpoint, this year is likely to put us in a position where if the Iranian program doesn't change, we may no longer have confidence that we can fulfill our objective of prevention. I think both these factors are going to increase the prospect that we will put a very serious diplomatic proposal on the table. Some point before the end of this year, either we're going to find there's a diplomatic way out, or we're going to find that we could see the likelihood of the use of force. One way or the other, 2013 is likely to be decisive on Iran, unless the Iranians on their own decide to go slow, which they could do. That we have to see. Right now, they're not going slow in their nuclear program. Right now, they're introducing a next generation of centrifuges which can dramatically increase the amount of enriched uranium that they can produce. So I'm painting a pretty daunting picture for the Middle East because that's the reality. And I haven't even touched on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So why don't I touch on the Israeli-Palestinian issue? You know, almost in some ways, you know, when you look at the other problems I've just talked about, you might draw the conclusion, well, this one must be easier, right? Isn't there one out there that must be easier than the others? And the answer is, not so fast. You know, I've worked on this issue for a long time. I've worked on the question of Arab-Israeli peace for a long time. We are in, by the way, the 20th year. This is the 20th year since Oslo began. And Oslo represented a psychological breakthrough between Israelis and Palestinians, because prior to Oslo, Israel and the PLO basically engaged in a policy of mutual denial, mutual rejection. Oslo represented a psychological breakthrough because there was mutual recognition for the first time. Oslo was based on a principle of a kind of incremental approach, its own version of step-by-step. It produced a number of interim agreements. Sarah referred to one that I worked on. Actually, I worked on several. I mediated the Hebron Accord. And there were high hopes at one point that we would actually produce what would be an agreement and a two-state outcome. Now, here we are in the 20th year, and today both publics, the Israeli public and the Palestinian public, are disbelieving. If you look at the polling on each side, you find a mirror image. You'll find majorities, they're becoming a little smaller than they used to be, but you'll still find significant majorities on each side that believe the best outcome is a two-state outcome. And you'll find the exact same numbers that are saying they believe a two-state outcome is the best outcome. You'll find the exact same numbers. Israeli and Palestinian will say they believe it will never happen. The biggest single problem we face today in terms of trying to produce peace between Israelis and Palestinians is disbelief. Both sides disbelieve the other. The Israeli public, I'm not just talking about leaders, I'm talking about the Israeli public. The Israeli public believes that the Palestinians do not accept a two-state outcome. They think when the Palestinians talk about two states, They think what they really mean is one state. And if anyone is talking about two states, what they really mean is a Palestinian state and a binational state. Not two states where there's a Palestinian state and there's the Jewish state of Israel. That's the view of the vast majority of Israelis. And the view, the vast majority of Israelis, has been enhanced by their sense that there's a great threat if they go down this road. From the standpoint of the Israelis, they withdrew unilaterally from Lebanon, and what did they get? They didn't get security, they didn't get peace, they got lots of Hezbollah rockets. And then later they withdrew from Gaza unilaterally, and what did they get? They didn't get security, they didn't get peace, they got lots of rockets. And the rockets meant that Israel's homeland was at risk. So the vast majority of the Israelis today don't believe the Palestinians are committed to a two-state outcome, and they see great risk in pursuing it. It doesn't mean they don't want it, because again, the polls show the vast majority, you're talking 70 to 75%, would like to see a two-state outcome, but they don't believe it'll ever happen. On the Palestinian side, a mirror image. The Palestinians say the Israelis are not committed to two states. And they say, if they were committed to two states, why are they building settlements in what should be our state? And they say, if they're really committed to two states, why do we see no real sign that they'll ever really surrender control over us? So if we're going in the 20th year of Oslo to change the situation, change the dynamic, produce meaningful progress, and preserve a two-state outcome as a real possibility, something has to happen. It can't be more of the same. If tomorrow you produced negotiations between the two sides, we would probably have a dialogue of the deaf. You need to change the context. You need to reestablish belief on each side. And so, as I wrestle with this, I've come up with an approach. And the approach is not to take the place of negotiating on borders, on security, on refugees, and on settlements. Those are the core issues of the conflict, and the two sides have to address those issues. The question is, can we get them to address the issues if we don't change the dynamic? Can we get them to address the issues in a way that will produce an outcome if we don't restore belief? Belief is not the same as confidence. Confidence is trivial compared to belief. Belief is faith. We're in a chapel. Belief is faith. When you lose faith, it's fundamental, and they've lost faith. So to think that you're going to solve borders, security, settlements, refugees, and Jerusalem, if you don't restore faith, is an illusion. So the question is, how can we put ourselves in a position to restore faith so we can take on the issue of the permanent status questions of borders and refugees and security and settlements and Jerusalem? And my suggestion is an agenda for initial discussions, not to take the place of the other discussions, but to show that if negotiations resume, something is different. If tomorrow you had negotiations resume, it isn't just, as I said, you'd have a dialogue of the deaf. The Palestinian public would look at them, and the Israeli public would look at them and say, no way, nothing's going to happen. And the only way you're going to affect that is if they see something different. If negotiations begin and they begin to produce something that's different. So my agenda for discussions involves a number of steps or actions that the Israelis would be prepared to take, and a number of steps or actions that the Palestinians would be prepared to take. I'm not in favor of them doing it unilaterally. I want them to discuss these items. I want them to create coordination between the two. I want them to create a virtuous cycle. I want them to show that something can change. I want them to give their publics a reason to take a second look. And that's what the purpose of this agenda is. It's an agenda for discussions. So what are the steps or suggestions that I have for the Israelis to be prepared to say to the Palestinians, to be prepared to actually take, if the Palestinians will take parallel actions? On the Israeli side, I divide them into 6 points, half of which are designed to address the question of showing that the Israelis are actually committed to two states, and the other half are designed to show they really are prepared to give up control. So the first thing, the Israelis would be prepared to offer compensation to any settlers who would be prepared to move back into Israel or into the settlement blocks that are to the west of the security barrier. That would send a signal immediately. Look, we're not about expanding in what should be your state. In fact, just the opposite. We're about giving incentives to settlers to leave. Second step, build housing within Israel or within the blocks for those who would leave. If you were to poll the Israeli settlers who were forced to leave Gaza, you would find almost to a person that they would say they weren't taken care of. So not only does building for them send a signal also to Palestinians, we mean what we say, but it also sends a signal to the settlers that actually you're going to try to take care of them. A third step, build only within the blocks to the west of the security barrier. Now, I'm not saying to do this forever. I'm not saying that the blocks are something that the Palestinians agree to. The blocks are something that the Palestinians and the Israelis, when it comes time to resolve the border, they're going to have to agree on what the size of the blocks will be and what the size of the swaps would be in return for it. But right now, if the Israelis were to stop building to the east of the barrier, if they're building only to the west of the security barrier, then the Israelis would be building in roughly 8% of the West Bank, and they wouldn't be building in roughly 92% of the West Bank. The Israelis could say, look, we're no longer building in what we think should be part of your state. The only places we're building are in what we think should be part of our state, and even here we're prepared to negotiate over the size of the blocks. But it would send an immediate signal that, again, we're for real when we say we're for a two-state outcome. All right, the fourth point on the Israeli side. The West Bank, as a result of the negotiations during the interim period, the last agreement we had was the Wye River Memorandum, which I helped to basically negotiate. And that divided the West Bank. The original interim agreement divided the West Bank into A, B, and C areas. After the Wye River Memorandum, the C area, which is where the Israelis retain civil responsibility and security responsibility, was 60.1% of the West Bank. 60.1% of the West Bank. There the Israelis retain basically complete control. So my fourth point would be the Israelis would be prepared to open up Area C for economic activity, presence, and ownership on the Palestinian side. To give you an example, all of the rock quarries in the West Bank are in Area C. One of the larger industries among Palestinians is stonemasonry, but they don't own any of the rock quarries. So open up Area C for economic activity. A, what it will do is it will immediately signal the Israelis are prepared to surrender control, to reduce control. But in addition to that, it will do a lot economically for the Palestinian Authority at a time when it needs economic help. So that's the fourth point for the Israelis. The fifth relates to Area B. Area B is 21.7% of the West Bank. You can obviously see that I haven't spent too much time on this issue. 21.7% of the West Bank. The Palestinians here have responsibility for civil, and they have responsibility for law and order, but they don't have responsibility for dealing with terror. That remains an Israeli responsibility. I would expand the Palestinian security presence. I would expand the Palestinian security responsibilities. Already the IDF coordinates very systematically with the Palestinian security forces. There's no reason why they can't broaden the scope of their responsibilities in Area B. Again, it sends a message about reduced Israeli control, greater Palestinian authority. In Area A, which is 18.2% of the West Bank, here the Palestinians have civil responsibility and security responsibility. Here they basically have a kind of putative control over their own lives. Now the Israelis, for security reasons, will still have incursions into Area A. It grates on the Palestinians. So my suggestion here is, by the way, when the Israelis do it, there's a reason. My suggestion here is have the Israelis, have the IDF identify very clear security criteria. If the Palestinians meet them, the Israelis don't go back in. If they don't meet them, they have a justification. I can tell you right now there are parts of the West Bank where the Palestinians would probably be able to meet them. Ramallah, Bethlehem, other parts that will be more problematic. But if you do this, you start this process, I think it could have a meaningful change. All right? So there's 6 points for the Israelis. Now I have 6 points for the Palestinians. You'll note when I focus on the Israelis, it's quite tangible. It's very concrete. I owe Sarah this because she raised this question with me, so I'm responding to it now. She raised it earlier in the day, so I'm responding to it now. The points on the Palestinian side are much less tangible, but they're no less real for the Israeli public. The steps that I identified on the Israeli side are designed to get at the problem Palestinians have in looking at the Israelis. They say, you're building in what should be a part of our state, therefore you don't believe in two states. So I say, let's take steps that show you won't build in the major part of what should be the Palestinian state. The second Palestinian concern is you control us. So that means you'll never really accept our independence in two states. So the second 3 points are designed to address the issue of control. Now on the Israeli side, the Israeli perception of the Palestinians is they don't believe in two states. They basically don't accept the legitimacy of Israel. They basically aren't prepared to live with Israel. So that, almost by definition, is more psychological. And so the points on the Palestinian side are designed to address the psychology. So the first point on the Palestinian side, put Israel on a map. You can't find Israel on a map. You think Israelis have a reason to doubt whether Palestinians are committed to two states? Go to the Palestinian Authority, look on their website, find any map that they show of Palestine, and there is no Israel. Okay? You want to affect an Israeli perception? Put Israel on the map. I once asked one of the Palestinian negotiators, why isn't Israel on a map? And he said, because we don't know its borders. And I said, you know what you want its borders to be? Put it that way. Put Israel on a map. Point 1. Again, be prepared to discuss this with the Israelis as part of the agenda. Point 2. Talk about two states for two peoples. There are two national movements. There are two national identities. Talk about two states for two peoples. Today, the Palestinians don't do that. They'll say two states. They never say two states for two peoples. You want to address the Israeli doubts? Talk about two states for two peoples. Again, we're dealing with the Israeli perception, which is a public perception, that the Palestinians really don't believe in two states, or at least one that leaves Israel as a state. So that's the second point. Third point, stop the incitement. The Israelis are not responsible for every evil. They're not responsible for every ill. You know, about 2 weeks ago, there was one of the Palestinian mayors put out that the IDF was leaving behind bombs that were disguised as toys to blow up Palestinian kids. Completely untrue. But it takes on a life of its own. You know, you have the chief imam in Jerusalem who gives a sermon where he says all Jews are descended from apes and pigs. Nobody in the Palestinian Authority disputes it. You have the head of the Palestinian Olympic Committee sends a letter to the IOC saying there shouldn't be a moment of silence at the Olympics for the Israeli athletes who were murdered in Munich in 1972. You name squares for people who kill Israelis. Stop the incitement. That's the third point. Fourth point, be prepared to prepare your public for peace. When I used to deal with Yasser Arafat, and I dealt with him more than anybody else, he used to always say to me that he was working for the peace of the brave. So take Arafat's phrase, the peace of the brave, and be prepared to say that the peace of the brave means that both sides, not only Israel, have hard decisions to make for peace. That, by the way, is a fact. But don't always say it's only up to Israel. Both sides, according to the peace of the brave, have hard decisions to make for peace. A fifth point. About 6 years ago, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, asked the question, where does it say that Palestinians should live in squalid conditions? And what he was getting at is the conditions of Palestinians in the refugee camps. Now in the West Bank today, about 8% of the population lives in refugee camps. You know, one of the things that could be done is just rebuild the housing there. Build permanent housing there, and let those Palestinians who live in those camps, let them move out if they want to. You don't have to say a thing, just do it. He will send a very clear message to the Israeli public. The sixth point is more about what the Palestinians are doing for themselves, but it will send a message about the kind of neighbor a Palestinian state would be. Continue to focus on building the institutions of your own state without encroaching on Israel, and focus on the rule of law. Many of the demonstrations that have taken place against the Palestinian Authority are over corruption. Do initiatives on the rule of law. It'll be seen by your own public, and it will send a message to you, to the Israeli public, about the kind of neighbor you're prepared to be. Okay, so there's 6 points for an agenda for the Israelis to put on the table, 6 points for the Palestinians to put on the table for discussions, and I have actually 4 more points. Now, it's true, when I wrote this article in the New York Times, they said I had a 14-point agenda, because it's the way it was laid out visually. So there were 6 points on each side, and then there were 7 and 8. So we call that 14. But in truth, it's 16, because the last 2 points are mutual points. I want each side to take them. This I want them to sign up to when they sit down with each other. The first thing I want them to do, the 7th point on each side, I want them to agree to an exchange of youth starting as early as the 3rd grade. Why do I say this? The only Israelis Palestinian kids see are either Israeli settlers or soldiers. And I can assure you that their encounters aren't good. And so it's very easy for Palestinian kids as they grow up to completely demonize and dehumanize the Israelis. Now, Israeli kids aren't seeing Palestinians. And it's pretty easy for them to do the same. So I want the 2 sides to agree to create regular exchanges, preside over regular youth exchanges starting as early as the 3rd grade. Because you've got to, not only do you have to change the dynamic now and change beliefs, you've got to socialize the kids differently than they're being socialized today. So that's the 7th point on each side. Then the 8th point on each side. We need each side to acknowledge in public when the other does something positive. They don't do that. And yet they do positive things. And it would make a big difference if when the Israelis do something that's positive, the Palestinians would publicly acknowledge it. And when the Palestinians do something that's positive, the Israelis would publicly acknowledge it. You know, we've heard about the Israelis withholding tax funds. Well, they're now sending them again. But we don't hear about the fact that 3 times during the last year, the Israelis advanced, before they were required to, monies because the Palestinians needed it. They weren't getting money from the Arabs, so the Israelis advanced the tax revenues. You wouldn't know that from anything that was said. Why not acknowledge that? Hadassah Hospital will treat any Palestinian, no questions asked, no charge. Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. Would you know that? Why isn't that publicly acknowledged? There's an act of humanity. The Palestinian security forces do their jobs professionally. They fulfill their obligations. Ask anybody in the IDF, that's what they'll tell you. Privately. Say it publicly. These are just examples. The whole idea is create a cycle that becomes more virtuous. These points are an agenda for discussion. I know you got a handout as you walked in here that accused me of being Bibi Netanyahu's lawyer and was referring to the article I wrote. It's interesting. Obviously, the person who wrote it decided he would write his own article about me as opposed to the article I wrote. You know, he said I was for annexation. I didn't say that, but he did. You know, when you deal with this conflict, one of the things you deal with is everybody has an agenda. And the conflict is emotional by definition. And everybody comes to it with a point of view. And if your point of view isn't accepted, then you have to basically discredit the other side. That's the reason, by the way, this conflict has endured for so long. If we had an approach to conflict resolution that was about solving problems as opposed to scoring points, we'd be in a very different place. The handout you got was about scoring points, not about solving problems. I'm about solving problems. I believe that when we look at the Middle East, we have more problems than we can possibly deal with, and it's time we begin to find a way to move in a better direction. I'll stop there and take questions.
I have the mic. Can you hear me? I have the mic here, and I will bring it to people who want to ask questions. It's questions, not statements, and they're going to be short so that a lot of people can talk.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just have a quick question. To what extent do you think Christian Zionism has influenced the U.S. policies? And does that cause an obstacle to the peace process?
What was the second part? I didn't hear the second part.
And does it cause a significant obstacle to the peace process?
It's an interesting question. Actually, want to hear the question too. Huh? Okay. The question was, to what extent has Christian Zionism, I'm going to paraphrase, sort of contributed to the problem as opposed to helping solve the problem? It's hard to know. I mean, I understand why you asked the question. I guess my answer to it would be, anybody who will focus on this conflict as if it's a morality play, where one side is all right and the other side is all wrong, is probably not going to be helping in the solution. That there are Christian Zionists who are prepared to support Israel, I think that's a good thing. I can understand why. I think that their support for Israel should also be done in a way that also makes peace more likely.
So Morsi was democratically elected into Egypt, and then one of the first major things he does was to try and rid himself of accountability. So my question is, to what extent do you think Morsi is willing to actually put Egypt's best interests at heart and move forward in a manner in which America thinks is a good way to move forward and a good way to move forward for Egypt?
Did you hear the question? No. Is that mic working? I don't think so. The question was, President Morsi was democratically elected in Egypt, but is he really, because he acted to do away with judicial restraints, is he really acting in the best interest of Egypt? And I guess, look, I think that President Morsi is a product of the Muslim Brotherhood, and most of the appointments that he has made throughout the Egyptian government are from the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I'm sure he would say, in doing this, he's serving the best interests of Egypt as he sees the best interests of Egypt. I guess the proof will be in the pudding. At this point, if he proceeds in a very exclusionary way, it's hard to see how he's going to produce the kind of gross stability that Egypt needs to advance. If he becomes more inclusive, he said that he wants a dialogue, but at this point, the opposition is highly dubious of that. Now, the opposition also has to make it possible. It can't be that, if he really genuinely reaches out, that they don't respond. The problem is they don't believe he's really genuinely reaching out, and he looks at them and thinks they're just trying to subvert him. So we have this problem in Egypt today where each side is developing a narrative, and the narrative of the Muslim Brotherhood is that basically the remnants of the regime are resisting, what the Muslim Brotherhood and President Morsi are trying to do, and the others who are in the opposition are somehow being tools of the remnants of the regime or foreign actors. They sound a lot, by the way, like what Mubarak used to say about those who are opposed to him were being tools of outside actors. So at some point you're going to have there's going to have to be some kind of meaningful political process that includes the opposition. Their concerns are going to have to be addressed. President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood are going to have to realize that they won an election with 51% of the vote. They are acting as if they won 90% of the vote. They are acting as if it's majoritarian rule with no respect for anyone else. And if they want to succeed, they're going to have respect for others as well. And the opposition is going to have to, if there's a genuine outreach, the opposition is going to have to go along. But at this point, it's very difficult.
It is my understanding that the majority of the Arab citizens of Israel, which comprise about 20% of the population of Israel, do not feel represented by the Palestinian Authority and do not want to be part of a Palestinian state. They would rather stay within the Israeli state. So how are you to reconcile, and also that the Israeli constitution stipulates that the government is the government of the citizens of Israel, which includes the Arab citizens of Israel. So how are you to reconcile this with your second ask from the Palestinians, which is 2 states for 2 peoples?
I'm not sure I picked up all of that. Let me sort of repeat what I heard and correct me if because I want to understand what you're asking. One, you're talking about the Arab citizens of Israel who do not want to be a part of the Palestinian Authority. Is that what you're saying? Right. And then 2, there are Arab citizens of Israel, and therefore when you talk about 2 states for 2 peoples, what do I mean? Is that what you're getting at? Okay. Well, first of all, the Arabs in Israel, the Arab citizens of Israel, represent about 22% of the population. So you can have what is a Jewish state that respects the civil rights without discrimination against their other citizens, the Arab citizens. That still permits 2 states for 2 peoples. Just because those Arabs who live in Israel prefer to stay in Israel or prefer not to become part of the Palestinian Authority doesn't preclude this possibility. By the way, when we were at Camp David in the year 2000, the Palestinian negotiators suggested that those Israeli settlers who were in the West Bank who didn't want to leave could stay, but they would be under the sovereignty and the law, the authority of the Palestinian state. So if you can have Arab citizens in Israel, you can also have some Arab citizens of Israel. You can also have some Jews who are citizens within the Palestinian state. It doesn't change the fact that the vast majority is still representing something different. So you'll have a Palestinian identity, and you'll have what is the Jewish character of Israel is preserved. I think you can have both. I would say one other thing. I think the numbers of Israeli Arabs, there's no doubt that there's a certain percentage of them that will want to remain as Israeli citizens. But there's also a certain percentage that if the Palestinian state was a genuinely democratic state with an unmistakable rule of law, with an economy that was functioning, I suspect that you would find some significant percentage, particularly of the younger Israeli Arabs, who would be prepared to be part of the Palestinian state. But that's something that can be seen over time. It's not something that it has to be done voluntarily. They're Israeli citizens, and they can't be forced to give up their citizenship.
Hi, my name is Rachel Sider, and I'm the president of the J Street U group on campus. And my question is about your claim for your third point about Israel only building in 8% of the West Bank. And my question for you is why still go forward with the 8% in the West Bank when that just undermine the viability for equal land swaps later down the road with that 3 to 4% that has typically been negotiated in the peace process?
I didn't fully hear that, I think. You're asking about, so I'll repeat again and you correct me where I'm wrong. You're asking about, I was suggesting building only in 8% of the West Bank, not in 92%. And what was the question? Oh, all right. Right. In other words, why not just have a settlement freeze in all beyond? I would say because I'm trying to focus on something that I think actually can happen, and at the same time has meaning for the Palestinians. If the reason that Palestinians don't believe, at least in part, that the Israelis are committed to 2 states is because the Israelis are building unquestionably in what they think even many Israelis will say would be part of the Palestinian state, then I say stop in that part. There are Israelis who will say, look, we should have, we're going to need settlement blocks, and in return for the settlement blocks, we'll have a swap. So we're only going to build in what we think should be part of Israel. So I'm trying to focus on something I think that can happen, number one, that addresses the argument, why are you building in what you think should be part of our state? The 8% represents a view on the part of Israelis that they think should be part of Israel. So the only place that the Israelis would be building in those parts of the West Bank that they think should be part of Israel, not in the part that they think should be part of Palestine.
Good evening. I had a question.
I've heard a lot of stories about some Palestinians and I some people who they were driven out of their home and they still have the key, and these are the people, like the key to their house, and these are still the people who live in these refugee camps that you were talking about. And you said that if the Palestinians would build houses for these refugees and they would go and live with these, it would be a good idea. But a lot of these refugees feel like if they would move into permanent housing from these refugee camps, they would be, in a sense, giving up on their struggle. So how could we change the mindset of these people, or is it even necessary to change the mindset?
First of all, the only people who would move out would be the people who would want to move out. The point would be, for those who would like to move out of the camps, they should be allowed to do so. Maybe many won't, but those who would want to, they should be allowed to do so, number one. Number two, the other issue, as I said, is in answer to what Abu Mazen said, is where does it say that Palestinians should live in squalid conditions? Why shouldn't you build better housing there? Is there a reason that people should live in terrible conditions? I don't think so. And that's what he was asking, the same question. When he asked that question, he had in mind putting permanent housing in camps. He had in mind addressing what were the terrible conditions there. And the point here is, the minute you do that, you're sending a signal that at a minimum, you're prepared to address the needs of your people in a practical way. And as you begin to address the needs of your people in a practical way, that also sends a message to the Israelis. We're dealing with perceptions on each side of disbelief. And if you don't do anything, then it's very easy to see this disbelief harden to the point where nothing is going to be possible. You know, these agenda items that I'm identifying, they're not necessarily, you know, the only ones that could be offered, but they're the ones that occurred to me about how can I address the disbelief on each side. What each side's looking at the other, what is it that could influence them to think differently about the other? You know, when you're dealing with a conflict like this, you have to change the impression of the other. And if you don't change the impression of the other, you simply perpetuate the conflict.
If we're worried about perception, why does the United States continue to financially support Israel? That does give the perception that we agree with what they're doing to the Palestinians. If you don't want to say occupation, from what I understand, from what I've read, and I've never been there, the Israelis bulldoze down houses, they poison water wells, they poison sheep, they cut down olive trees, they block roads that lead to the universities and to jobs. But we continue to financially support Israel at a time when we're in a lot of trouble here. We continue to support them. And why? It seems a simple question. Why do we do that?
It is certainly not the policy of the Israeli government to poison wells. It is not the policy of the Israeli government to poison sheep. It is not the policy of the Israeli government to very consciously take the steps that you're describing. Can I say that some of the more extreme settlers don't take those acts? I can't say that. But it's certainly not the policy of the Israeli government, and they do try to prevent what you're describing. You're asking a different question, though, because what you were focused on a set of behaviors which you identify as being abhorrent, and obviously those are not behaviors, A, that the Israeli government carries out, but also the American government doesn't support. It wouldn't support. The question is, why do we support Israel? We have a long-standing commitment to Israel, number one. It's been it is a country that is in the Middle East. It is a democracy. It is a country that is governed by the rule of law. It has a separation of powers. and it shares, from that standpoint, it shares our values. And this has been something that Republican and Democratic administrations alike have supported. We have had a commitment to Israeli security because Israel in the past has faced threats from a neighborhood that has rejected its existence. And so if you ask me, why do we support Israel? Because we have long-standing commitments to it, because we see a like-minded democracy, and that has shaped American policies pretty much since the 1970s. It wasn't always that way. I mean, it was about 25 years before the United States became the prime provider of assistance, economic and military, to Israel. It was really only after the 1973 war where we became more prominent. Then it was after the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, after Camp David, where we then established what were very regular commitments to provide assistance to Israel, which was matched not quite by the same ratio, but by assistance to Egypt, the Camp David states. So that's why we provide support to them.
People will be able to ask questions out there personally.
Hi, thank you for coming. I might have missed something, but I'm wondering if your plan would address the issue of checkpoints.
It's a good question. I didn't list it as one of my points. Checkpoints have been dramatically reduced over the last few years. The number of fixed checkpoints have gone down, by about a factor of 6 or 7. There are still, from time to time, what I'll call sort of flying checkpoints, meaning not fixed. I do think, if you create a virtuous cycle of the sort I'm talking about, I would expect that to be dealt with. For me, I think the bigger question has to do, because for the most part the checkpoints have gone down dramatically. I think the bigger issue is what can be done to facilitate the movement of commerce for Palestinians. The cost of commerce is high because of cargo having to be taken off of one truck and put onto another one. And coming up with more efficient ways of dealing with the movement of goods from the Palestinian, from Palestinian areas into Israel, and even moving towards greater trade between the West Bank and Gaza. These would be important things that I think could emerge from creating a virtuous cycle. As I said, the points I put in, they're not designed to be exhaustive. If the two sides, this is designed to be an agenda for discussion between the two sides, geared towards dealing specifically with the perceptions of disbelief that each has about the other. If they would come and they would begin talking and they would begin taking steps and they would say, look, if you were to take that step, this would have a really big effect on us and we would be prepared to do that, fine. I'm all for them coming up with an improved agenda. But I'm trying to start somewhere to change the dynamic, because I understand one thing. If things stay as they are, we're going to get to the point where I suspect that what is a Palestinian national movement may be transformed. The Islamists may take over among the Palestinians too. And when they take over, they treat all of the land of Palestine as an Islamic trust, for which there can be no peace and no acceptance of Israel. Now, eventually they may not govern after another generation, but we could lose even the possibility for another generation. So I don't want disbelief to become so profound that the ability to negotiate anything disappears, or that the very identity of the Palestinians, given the rise of political Islam, changes. Because I think this becomes a religious conflict, not a national conflict. The ability to solve it becomes dramatically harder.
I know that there are a lot of people who want to ask questions. I see a lot of hands, but maybe the last question can go to one of the adults, the people from the community, because I saw several hands and we didn't give you a chance.
Thank you. My understanding as an amateur at this is that Russia has played a pernicious role in Syria. I'm wondering, in terms of the 4 areas that you talked about, Is Russia playing a role elsewhere? Is China playing a role? What are their interests?
The Russians and the Chinese are part of the 5+1 mechanism with the Iranians, and there they have actually cooperated pretty closely with us in the approach on negotiations. Whether they would cooperate on the bigger kind of endgame proposal that I'm suggesting, I don't know. But at least on that they cooperate. On Syria, the answer is clearly not. And it's hard to explain the position they have. Early on, it could have been because this is the one place where they actually have a naval port, and they had a relationship with Assad, and they worried about what would happen if he was gone. But the longer this goes on, the harder it is to protect their own position within Syria. Whoever replaces Assad is very unlikely to look at to look at the Russians, Freudian slip, to look at the Russians with a very accepting eye. So it's hard to understand why they have maintained the posture that they have. But clearly on this one, they have helped to perpetuate the conflict in Syria, which is just catastrophic. Now, part of the argument that Putin makes is that he doesn't know who would replace Assad. Well, by helping to keep Assad in power, he makes the worst outcome more likely, not less likely. The Chinese are the Chinese kind of follow the Russians on this. They let the Russians take the lead. They've supported the Russian positions in the UN because the two have a kind of understanding on supporting Security Council resolutions that might ever look like they're trying to interfere in domestic affairs. And they don't want they don't want Security Councils to be messing with their domestic politics, and so they tend to agree that they'll create this kind of wall of protection against Security Council resolutions that seem to be intrusive when it comes to changing the domestic order in any place.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And